The Maya Calendar. As you might have heard, the Maya calendar is incredibly sophisticated. From a modern perspective, it is at once very impressive and at the same time unnecessarily complicated. But this complexity is just a reflection of the sacred reference that the Maya gave to the passage of time and the associated motion of the heavenly bodies. Now, let's take a look at what they found. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. We'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface-level understanding you get on other channels. Go check it out for yourself. Let's start. If we want to have any chance at understanding the Maya calendar, we first have to understand their counting system. Cleverly, they used only 3 symbols, a dot for 1, a horizontal line for 5, and a shell for 0. The inclusion of 0 here is significant, as many civilizations, including the Greeks, who are so well known for their mathematics, did not invent the 0. And here we have the first 20 symbols of their counting system. First we have that shell for 0, then we count up to 4 in dots, and from 5 onwards we use those bars, which represent 5. Strangely, and this is not properly understood, the Maya used a base 20 numeral system, as opposed to our base 10 or decimal system that we use today. This means that they had distinct symbols, we've just seen them, for 0 to 19, but for higher numbers they would combine these symbols using place value notation, similarly to what we do today. Let me explain. The modern number 41, for instance, doesn't mean 4 plus 1 is 5. The 4, since it occupies the second place from the right, instead has the value 4 times 10 is 40. The Maya did the same, but now with their base 20 system. So 41 in Mayan becomes 4 times 20 is 80 plus 1 is 81. And here we see 2 examples of how to write these numbers in Mayan notation. Let's start with the example on the left. We read those numbers from bottom to top. The first number on the bottom says 6. It's the horizontal stripe and the dot, 6. And the number above it reads 4, but 4 times 20 is 80. So the number on the left is 86. Now the example on the right. We start with a 2 at the bottom. Then we get a horizontal bar, so a 5, but it's 5 times 20 is 100. And here we have even another sign above it, which reads 6, but becomes 6 times 20 times 20 is 2,400. So in total, this number adds up to 2,502. If you thought this number system was a bit hard compared to the one we use today, wait until you see the Mayan script. Let's now dig into that. The Mayan script, which dates back to at least the 3rd century BC, is the most famous and also the most beautiful writing system of the Americas. The script was finally deciphered with great difficulties in the 1970s by various scholars. What made this decipherment especially difficult is that there are glyphs or letters for both words and sounds. And on top of this, every glyph also exists in many variations. For instance, here are 3 glyphs representing the word 0. We've already seen the top one, the shell, but it also comes as a face and also as a complete human being. And here we see many ways to write the letter U. So now you probably understand why it took a long time to decipher these texts. As you might imagine, writing among the Mayans was seen as an art form, and writers were allowed to change these glyphs according to their own artistic taste. In fact, the Mayan word for painter is the same as their word for writer, which explains a lot, considering what I've just told you. Now we're going to approach the calendar. Let's first discuss the earliest appearances of the Mesoamerican calendar. The oldest written date that we find in Mesoamerica didn't belong to the Mayas, but to the Zapotec civilization. It is dated to about 600 BC and shows a captive next to a glyph that reads 1 earthquake. Unfortunately, this date doesn't specify the year it was made, but only what day in the Mesoamerican 260-day calendar that came to be used all over Mesoamerica, and that we'll discuss in a bit. And here we see that oldest date, the captive, and underneath his feet we see those earliest glyphs. The first fully readable year, corresponding to 32 BC, comes from a late Olmec site, and we can see it here on the right. The date reads, and you can read along with me on the stone, 7, a bar and 2 dots, then 16, 6, another 16, and then 18. How to convert this row of numbers into an actual date we'll discuss in a bit, but it turns out it corresponds in our calendar to 32 BC. And here we see the bottom half of that stone. But remember, that stone was actually found in 2 pieces and they're now in 2 different musea. With some imagination, there is an even earlier date. In the stela on the right, we might read the numbers 7, 16, 3, 2, 13, although the first 2 numbers aren't directly given. And this would correspond to 36 BC, which is 4 years older than the previous example. The reason we can probably assume the 7 and the 16 is that those dates correspond to huge periods of time. So these 2 numbers are there in all the historic cases. Much more impressive is the La Majora Stela 1, also from that Olmec site, which dates to 156 AD. And the stela also contains the first large text for Mesoamerica. And here we see that beautiful piece of art. And here you see an actual photograph of it. It's actually quite hard to read the glyphs on the stone, and that is the reason scholars have made the drawing you saw on the previous slide. So far we've discussed the pre-Mayan cases, but the Mayans took the calendar to the next level. They created what is easily the most intricate calendar of the ancient world, combining many ways to describe a single date. Let's start with their sacred calendar of 260 days. It is called the Tzolkin. Each day in this cycle was described by a combination of one of 20 day glyphs combined with 13 numbers, number 1 to 13. And this gives a total of 20 times 13 is 260 combinations. How to run through this calendar is in modern days often depicted by 2 interlocking wheels. This, by the way, is not how the Mayans envisioned it itself, but it is a useful way to understand it. This calendar starts at 1 imix, as you can see. If the wheels then turn, we go to 2 ik, then 3 akbal, 4 kan, etc. And this continues for 260 days until we get back to that 1 imix, which will be the start of a new cycle. And here we see those 20 day names, often given in various forms. Many hypotheses have been proposed to understand the function of this 260-day calendar, but none of them are truly convincing. What is certainly unhelpful is that it doesn't sync with the year cycle, so also not with the agricultural cycle. From a modern perspective, it just seems completely arbitrary. One theory is that it is linked to the period between the appearance of Venus as a morning star and an evening star, which is about 260 days. But this pattern doesn't recur every 260 days, so it doesn't sync up with the calendar at all. Others believe that it might be linked to the period of Mars, which happens to be 3 times 260 days, is 780 days. This would actually work, but there's no actual evidence for this. And there are many other theories, but none of them, as I said, are very convincing. Besides the Tzolkin, there was also a system based on the 365-day solar year, which is called the Haab in Mayan. This cycle consists of one of 18 month glyphs combined with one of 20 numbers, in this case from 0 to 19. This adds up to a total of 18 times 20 is 360 days. Another 5-day 19th month is then added on top of this to get to the 365 days. And these last 5 days were considered a very unlucky, dangerous time. And here we see the glyphs for those 19 months. Then there was the so-called year-bearer system. It was found, and I'll explain it in a minute, that each solar year always started on just 4 day glyphs from the 260 Tzolkin system. Namely, the first day of each year always started on either the house glyph, the rabbit glyph, the reed glyph, or the flint glyph. Let's examine why. And please hang on here for a moment. As I've told you, there are 20 day glyphs in the Tzolkin system. After 18 full rounds through those 20 day glyphs, we get to 360. And then we have only 5 days left until the full year is finished. So to complete the year with those extra 5 days, that 20-day calendar had to advance by another 5 days. This can be done 4 times, since 4 times 5 days is 20, until we get back to the first glyph in that 20-day cycle. And this is the reason that the year always starts on one of these 4-day glyphs. Let's now also look at the 13-day cycle. As I've told you before, the Tzolkin system combines those 20 days with 13 numbers. After 28 full rounds of that 13-day cycle, we get to 364 days, which means we have only 1 day left until we get to the start of the next year. And this means that after a full year, the 13-day cycle has neatly advanced by only 1 day, which is quite a neat aspect of this calendar. So at the first day of each year, we run through those 4 day glyphs, while we also cycle to the numbers 1 to 13 in order. Quite brilliant, if you ask me. So to make it a bit more explicit, in this way we start each year first with 1 house, then 2 rabbit, then 3 reed, then 4 flint, and then at 5 we start at house again, then 6 rabbit, and we continue till 13, and then we start at 1 again. Running through those 4 name glyphs combined with those numbers 1 to 13, this calendar covered 4 times 13 is 52 years, until we got back to that first 1 house. And that cycle of 52 years is now called the calendar round. And it was also considered very important among the Mayans. On top of this, there was also the long count system. And this repeats itself after a period of over 5,000 years. The previous cycle started on August 11, 3114 BC, and it ended, as you all probably know, on December 21st, 2012. There was even a whole movie about this. Each day in this long count system calendar is described relative to this starting date, that 3114 BC, and it is counted in a number of days, which are called kins, in a number of 20-day winals, in a number of 360-day tons, then we have 7,200-day katuns, and 144,000 baktuns. In modern notation, the first day of the cycle is described as 00000, and the cycle ends 13 baktuns later, or 130000, when the Mayans believed that a new phase of creation would start. And this cycle together is about 5,000 years. And here we see a number of variants of glyphs for those kins, winals, and so on. On top of this, there were also a number of lunar cycles that were tracked. One indicates the phase of the moon, and another one counts the lunar months from 1 to 6, which turns out important for predicting lunar and solar eclipses. And finally, there is a curious 819-day cycle, which according to one theory, but this isn't confirmed, is related to the orbital times of Jupiter and Saturn, respectively 399 and 378 days. As it turns out, the highest common divisor of these two numbers is 21, and 819 is also a multiple of 21. So there might be something to it, but without direct evidence, I think it's a bit far-fetched. Now let's bring all these different calendars together. If Mayan texts give dates, they often bring all of these calendars together, which is actually quite peculiar, since only the long count system alone would be enough to determine a date in history. But of course, the point of their system was not just to determine a date. To them, it described a sort of cosmic spectacle to do with the planets and the moon and so on. As an example, let's study the so-called Leiden plaque. You can see it here in the photograph, although it isn't particularly clear. But here we have a much clearer drawing. From top to bottom, we first see an introductory sign, and then underneath it, we see the long count date: 8 baktoon, 14 katoens, 3 toons, 1 wijnal, and 12 kins. Since you know how to count in Mayan, you can now check that these numbers are correct. For instance, the first number is a horizontal line, it's now flipped vertical by the way, and 3 dots next to it, which is 8. The next are 2 horizontal lines and then 4 dots, which is 14, and so on. So the long count date is 8, 14, 3, 1, 12. And this date corresponds to 8 times that 144,000, 14 times the 7,200, 3 times 360, 1 times 20, and 12 times 1 day. And that together adds up to over 1 million days. If we add that large number of days to the starting date, August 11, 3114 BC, and we also correct for leap years, which is, by the way, quite a hassle, then we end up at September 15, 320 AD. Under the long count symbols, we also see the Tzolkin system, which in this case reads 1 ebb. Then underneath it, we have the Lord of the Night glyph, which is a 9-day cycle we haven't even mentioned. And then to the right and the bottom of that, we see the Haab system, which reads 0 yakskin. And then finally underneath, there are some glyphs describing the coronation of a ruler. And that date, of course, is the year that this ruler was crowned. As a final example, let's study the stela to the right. The text below gives the date of the ascension to the throne of a man called Bert Jaguar III. Here we see that same text in a clear format. The text starts with another introductory glyph. In modern jargon, it's actually called an introductory series initial glyph, or an ISIG. And it signals that a date will be given after that. Next come the 5 glyphs of the long count calendar. And if we do the same calculation we did just now, we find that it corresponds to May the 3rd, 752 AD. And then we get the Tzolkin date. Then we head into the second column, which gives the so-called supplementary series, which includes the lunar phase that we talked about, the lunation counter from 1 to 6, and also again a Lord of the Night glyph. And then finally in this case we get the Haab, the 365-day calendar. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the Maya calendar works. If you found this all very interesting, I would like to refer you to my book, In Search of the Sublime. Of course, you can buy a physical copy, but you can also read it for free online on worldhistorybook.com. I hope to see you there. Bye bye.